So this portion talks about Har Sinai, and that's how we know that Har Sinai is in current day Saudi Arabia. How do we know that? If we go to chapter 3, verse 1, that's the first place that we have a reference to Mount Sinai in the Torah, because the verse states, and what I'd like to do today is spend some time going through the midrashim that relate to Sinai, that relate to this verse of Horeb. It states in the verse, Moshe Yaroeh, Etzon Yitro no Kohen Mijan. Moshe was shepherding the sheep of Yitro, his father-in-law, who was a Kohen, a priest of Midian. And Moshe was in Midian. And he led the tzon after into the wilderness. And he came to the mountain of God, which was known as Mount Horeb. So this place that he came to was called the Mountain of God, and Rashi tells us about the future. It was called that, and it was called Horeb. So Moshe has now arrived when he's in Midian, and he was shepherding the sheep, and he wandered into the mountain, which was Horeb. Now, if you look at the map, you can't get from the Sinai Peninsula. You can't wander from Midian into the Sinai Peninsula. So it must be that Moshe was watching the sheep, and he came upon a special mountain in the Midian region. So there are these three major mountains that we could choose from. We could choose from Jebel Al-Lawz, which is a tall mountain. And actually to this day, Jebel Al-Lawz, if you climb like an hour up Jebel Al-Lawz, you'll find a cave that they call there the Cave of Eliyahu. And if you, and Eliyahu is the only person in the Bible, in the Tanakh, who visits Mount Sinai after Moses. After Moses, the only person who goes back to Mount Sinai is Elijah the prophet. And there is, to this day, a tradition on Jebel Al-Lawz. There's a tradition that there's a cave there that's called the Cave of Elijah. And that's only like a 1 hour hike up the mountain. If you want to climb up that mountain, Jebel Al-Lawz, it's doable, but it's a stage level 5 climb, meaning you need ropes and cave and climbing equipment. You need to be an experienced climber. But what's interesting is at the foot of that mountain, or in the vicinity of that mountain, there is a carving of a calf. They didn't have really cows around that area. They had sheep and goats. So they had a calf there, and that's associated by the locals with the worship that was done of the golden calf. So this is all part of the region. This is in Saudi Arabia. Now, I want to point out what Rabbi Soloveitchik says here, because you might think to yourself, well, Moshe wandered. It was just one time he wandered. He could have gone on a hike, a 3-day journey, and wandered to the Sinai Peninsula and gone to Har Sinai in the like what they call today Mount St. Catherine, which a lot of people say is Mount Sinai. The only reason why they say that's Mount Sinai is because Saudi Arabia has been closed for so many years. People couldn't get into it, and also because some people called it the Sinai Peninsula, so they said, okay, Sinai Peninsula, let's call it Sinai. Let me share with you what Rabbi Soloveitchik says about Moshe's relationship with this mountain. Let me share with you. It's a very powerful expression, but in order to do that, let me first read to you. Rabbi Soloveitchik is commenting on the Rashis. So Rabbi Soloveitchik says about this, and then after that, I'd like to read some of these midrashim about this mountain of Horeb. Rabbi Soloveitchik says the following. It says that Moshe came to the mountain of God of Horeb. So it says first in the Rashi, it says Moshe haya ro'eh, and Moses was a shepherd. So this, Rabbi Soloveitchik says, is in the grammatical form known as a participle. If it were to be simply translated as, and Moses shepherded, meaning to say in the past tense, then the phrase would read, Moshe ra'ah, Moses shepherded. That the grammatical construction of the phrase provides information about Moses' occupation during those many silent years where God was hiding God's face. Moshe was a roet son, a shepherd for a period of many years. It wasn't just once. He was an ongoing shepherd. Now, in contrast, the next phrase, Vayinhag et hatzon achar hamidbar, and Moses led the flock into the wilderness, does seem to be in the past tense. The Torah is describing a specific incident. At this point in the narrative, Moses led his sheep at this point into the desert. But Rashi says he should not interpret it that way. Rashi says, but should be a continuation of the participle construction, meaning to say, Rashi says, that Moses was doing this regularly. He was regularly leading his sheep into the desert to graze rather than stay in Midian, so the sheep will not graze in others' fields, meaning to say he led the sheep a little bit northwest from the southern point of Midian so that he would lead it into the wilderness because Moses did not want his sheep to be stealing from other people's lands. And so he led it into the wilderness. In the desert, there are no property rights and anyone's animals are allowed to graze there. So if you look at the map, if Midian is at the southeastern point of Saudi Arabia, Moses led his flock to graze north of that. Now, if the two phrases of the verse are interpreted as participles, that means to say that this was an ongoing activity that Moses was doing. The third phrase and final phrase must similarly be interpreted to remain consistent. Vayavo el har ha'elokim choreva, that he came to the mountain of God at Chorev, meaning to say, Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying that it wasn't a one-time event that Moses came to Mount Sinai to pray or to meet God, that this was an ongoing event. It wasn't just a fluke, so to speak, that he showed up at this mountain. This was a mountain near Midian where Moses would regularly go to pray. In Rabbi Soloveitchik's years, over many years, as Moses led his flocks of sheep, he alone would regularly visit Mount Chorev. Moses would regularly go to this mountain. The word sown suggests a large number of sheep, and Moses was certainly not the only shepherd of his flock. He had assistants. Yet whenever he came into the desert, he would leave the sheep in charge of his assistants and go to the mountain of God. What an incredibly creative explanation Rabbi Soloveitchik is teaching us. Moses did not go just once to Mount Sinai and see the burning bush. He went there many, many times. And this makes perfect sense as to why he would lead the children of Israel back to that place to receive the Torah, because this was the place where Moses used to go often. And why would he go? Besides Rabbi Soloveitchik, what was the purpose of this lonely journey? What did Moses do at the mountain? He prayed for his people, for his brothers, whom he left when he fled from Egypt. Moses had lost faith in his brothers. They were not worthy of freedom. Moses likely prayed that his brothers should rise spiritually and psychologically and develop a sense of dignity, no longer to be informers who spy on their brethren. Yet it was a time of Hester Panim. Moses received no answer until now. What an incredibly creative explanation of Rabbi Soloveitchik. He imagines that while Moses was in Midian, he used to regularly visit this mountain which we'll call Jebel Charev, which is today Jebel Charev, Mount Chorev, which is in southern Saudi Arabia, off the coast near Sharm el-Sheikh. And so that mountain was the mountain that Moses used to go regularly to pray to God. God did not reveal himself to Moses until one of the later times that Moses went. But Moses was praying for his brethren to wake up and recognize who this person was, that what was wrong with the people, that they had become informers, that they were turning, that they had lost their sense of dignity, and they weren't praying for freedom. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was doing this whole time when he was going to Mount Sinai. So it was not a singular experience that Moshe had at Mount Sinai and that Moses had when he went to Mount Sinai before he returned to Egypt. It was an ongoing experience. And in fact, later on in the verse, in the Torah, it tells us that where does he meet Aaron when he goes to meet Aaron? Where does he meet Aaron? It says, and this is one of the proofs that scholars say that it's Jebel Charev. It says that he meets Aaron. Here, what's the verse? It says, God says to Aaron, go to greet Moses in the wilderness. And Aaron met him. They met at the mountain of God. So must be, and it makes perfect sense if you see Jebel Charev on the map. It doesn't make sense to say that they met in the Sinai Peninsula, because you wouldn't go from, if you're going between Egypt and Midian, you would not go to the Sinai Peninsula to meet. You would meet at this mountain, if you look at the map, at Jebel Charev, which is in between Egypt and Midian. It's very clear that that's the place that they would meet. And they met indeed, it says in our verse, chapter 4, they met indeed at the mountain of God, and he kissed him over there. They met there and they kissed each other at that point. So, hold on one second. Okay, so let me just pause for a moment. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address them at this point.